Well, hello, Dana. How are you?
Hi there. I'm doing well, thank you.
Thank you. I am really happy that we got a chance to do this today. And welcome to Rare Awareness Radio. We are here with Dana Brenner, and Dana is a tremendous community leader, an advocate, and parent for so many things as it pertains to the rare disease landscape, which fits so well into what we try to do here at Rare Awareness Radio. We have a tremendous friend in common, and that is Adam Clatworthy from CRELD1 Warriors. We've just been able to get his episode out into the public. So hopefully people are
Great.
listening to it now and getting inspired by his tremendous story. So we'll formally thank Adam for connecting us, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, Adam is amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. Just such an amazing person. So before we kind of jump in, Dana, I would love for you to take a moment, introduce yourself. I certainly didn't do you justice in my introduction, so if you could just kind of tell us a little bit about yourself, and then I would love to talk about, this journey that you've been on, right? And so much of the incredible work that you've been doing.
Sure. Dana Brenner. I live in Oregon in a town called Wilsonville.
Nice.
Um, and I had a history actually, like Adam, I had some career experiences that sort of prepared me a little bit unexpectedly for the journey that I was on.
Right.
Um, I had worked with people with disabilities
Okay.
after my undergraduate degree and had done some working in the Disability Resource Center at the place in Boston, actually, where I went to graduate school.
Right.
And so I had spent time in that world, but certainly not as a parent.
Right. Much different
Um,
perspective, right?
Much
Yeah.
different. Yeah, and I entered into the world of rare disease when I had a son.
Mhm.
When I was later in life, I was 40 when I
Okay.
gave birth to this
Okay.
kiddo.
But people
And
are
I,
all trending in that direction now, right? I mean, we're all having children older. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, a lot of
Yeah.
people are. I had been a mom to two kids, but not that I had given birth to.
Okay.
And so when I had Raiden, who likes to go by Ray,
Okay.
my other two children, the youngest I had had one of them at was 1 year old.
Oh,
So I
wow.
hadn't I hadn't been through the infancy period.
Sure.
So I was learning about that as a mother at the same time that I was learning about what was happening with my child.
Yeah. Wow. Amazing.
And I had a business at the time. I was running a coaching, executive coaching and leadership development company.
Hmm.
And so also in the beginning, it was really about, figuring out how to be a parent and have a
Right.
business and then negotiating, what the needs were of both of those and eventually ended up, becoming really changing my work world to accommodate what was needed with my kids and particularly with Ray.
So you had a lot going on. You're a mom of three young children, right? You own your own business. Were you still in you weren't and you were through school and all that, obviously, by the time Ray was born,
Yeah.
but you still were a lot of balls in the air. Life starts to throw you this curveball now of Ray's diagnoses. And I certainly want to talk to you a little bit about, the decade long process, right? Which I know
Yeah.
from having spoken to you earlier of getting Ray to a diagnosis.
Yeah.
How do you kind of reflect back on that now, Dana?
Yeah, it really was a journey.
Mm,
It's such a different time
mm,
now than
mm.
it was then. And it's really only been 15 years. But the world of diagnoses and gene testing and what it's like as a parent
Mhm.
to look for a diagnosis is really different now than, let's say, it is for Adam or some of
Right.
the kids that are getting diagnosed now very young. So it definitely was a journey, and I was
Mm.
reflecting on it today that really the first 10 years, I was in the world of having an undiagnosed child.
Yeah.
And I have
How
even more
frustrating. Yeah. Yeah.
totally frustrating,
Yeah.
but totally a lesson in trying to be present with what is and the unknown. And so I think my journey was as much about learning about genetic syndromes in general
Right.
and how to navigate that world as it has been about getting this particular
Mm.
diagnosis. And when I think about the experience that I've had as a parent, it's very different than the experience of some of the folks in our CRELD1 family who learned pretty early on what it is that they were dealing with.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So that lack of comprehensive information, right, about CRELD1, about similar conditions, really impacted your ability, right? And I know you've done a lot in the last 15 years to sort of change that, right? Change that lack of comprehensive information. Can you talk a little bit more, Dana, about that?
Sure.
Mm.
Well, not even talking about comprehensive information, we didn't have a diagnosis.
Right, right, yeah.
We didn't even know what he had.
Mm,
And so we're a long way off from comprehensive information about this particular
sure.
condition. But for a long time, I didn't even have a diagnosis.
Yeah.
And, with Ray, the presentation when he was born, we knew something was wrong, mainly because he wasn't able to eat and
Wow.
he was losing weight.
Right.
And, they did not, his APGAR scores were fine, and
Mhm.
they didn't really realize that anything was wrong, except that in the beginning, he wasn't able to get any nutrition and he was
Mhm.
breastfeeding diligently. I was trying. And in
Sure.
the beginning, we thought there was just something wrong with that process. That process
Right.
is often
Well,
difficult
it's
for
often very
women.
I wouldn't know personally, but I know it's a very challenging process for many, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And actually, I kept going into the lactation consultant and they kept weighing him and we kept trying different things. And it was actually a lactation consultant who called the pediatrician and said, I
Wow.
think you need to take a look at this kid. I think he has some low muscle tone.
Okay.
And so we had actually been to our 2 week checkup.
Check up.
And
Yep.
we went back and they started to notice some things that indicated a genetic syndrome, a
Mm,
likely genetic syndrome.
mm,
Ray had a high arched palate, which is
okay.
often one
Yep.
of the things that I've learned along the way is about what we call the non-specific signs of genetic syndromes.
Interesting.
And there are some things that are sort of common across a whole array
Sure.
of genetic syndromes, but that indicate that there's probably some kind of an issue in this regard.
Mm,
So, pretty early on, they identified these non-specific symptoms, and then they began looking for the cause.
mm.
And so, in that first year, like a lot of kids, Ray went through an enormous amount of testing. And at the time, we were with a managed care organization, which is not very equipped
Not
to.
yeah, not the best situation, not the most optimal situation, right? Yeah.
No, we couldn't
Yeah.
get the testing needed. We did get some testing,
Sure.
but at the time, kind of the gold standard for figuring things out was whole exome genome
Genome
testing.
testing. Yep.
And back then, it was $20,000.
Yeah. And your HMO's like, no. Right. Yeah.
Not
Yeah.
only, yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, we could not get it to save our lives, and
Yeah.
as a matter of fact, in the first 5 years, we couldn't get it.
Wow.
And we knew that, after they actually told us, we think it might be this, we think it might be that,
Uh-huh.
and I would go down the avenue of thinking that he had all these different things that he never had,
Yeah.
and
And how heartbreaking is that, or just heart-wrenching is that whole process, right? We think it's this, oh, it's not. Now we think it's this, oh, it's not, right?
right.
And each time you get all geared up about the thing that might be, only to find out that it's not that. Right.
Yeah, a
Yeah.
lot of cycling through,
Yeah.
and honestly, you don't know what you don't know, and I never realized that so many people go undiagnosed.
Mm.
That they have diseases or conditions and no one knows what they are.
Right.
And you think about that. You think about it takes a while to get a diagnosis, but what I really didn't realize is that there are some diseases and conditions that haven't even been discovered yet,
Mhm. Mhm.
as was the case for us.
Right.
So we went down this road in the first few years of trying to get a diagnosis and dealing with symptoms. So dealing with within the first year, we had this hypotonia, we
Mhm.
had the feeding issues, the global delays in the milestones, we had obstructive apnea,
Mm.
we had seizures. So it would seem like there was something new to discover
Like every week, I'm sure, right? Yeah. Yeah.
every week,
Yeah.
and just continuing down the road of and for Ray, the biggest issue that presented was this muscle tone issue.
Mm.
And the first thing that had to be discovered was, what type of muscle tone issue is this? Is this neurological?
Interesting.
Is it muscle based, or
Mhm.
is it mitochondrial?
Mm.
Those were the three kind of categories. And so I was busy learning so much about these things and trying to do my own research. And this was back before Facebook groups. This was back,
Sure. Sure.
I think I told you that the way that I got information from other parents was through a list serve.
That's crazy. Yeah. Yeah.
And we were on a list serve for hypotonia.
Okay.
So looking at that as the major presenting symptom, and I still now, 15 years from when I got on there, have friends that I met in
That's
that
amazing.
group,
Yeah.
and they have, many of them, been through their own journeys of
Mhm.
finding the underlying cause of their children's hypotonia. There's 400 or 500 different causes of hypotonia
Wow.
as a nonspecific symptom.
Wow.
Yeah, and so there was a long journey. And in the beginning, they thought that he had neurologically based hypotonia.
Mhm.
It took about 5 years before we came to realize that his hypotonia is actually probably, well, there's the hypotonia, but he actually has muscular involvement that is also what they would call true muscular
Oh,
involvement and mitochondrial, likely
wow.
over the course of time. So, what I started doing as a parent is I started saying, I'm going to figure out how to get my kid what he needs, regardless of this insurance company.
Right.
And I was lucky enough to have the resources at the time that we could do things like go and do private pay at
Mm.
Johns Hopkins,
Mhm.
where they had a hypotonia clinic.
Oh, wow.
And it's no longer in existence. But at the time, it was, one of the major diagnostic areas. Out here in the West Coast, we don't have a lot of research based institutions.
Right.
And
Right.
that's where a lot of the cutting edge stuff was happening.
Sure. You
So,
mentioned John Hopkins and some of those other. Yeah.
yeah, so we went out there, and that doctor that we saw, he was fantastic. He really thought that maybe it was either neurological or connective tissue disorder.
Hmm.
And then you know, but wasn't able to diagnose him. And over time, I was really thinking that it was largely neurological, and he told us to expect sort of static, kinds of issues. And then when Ray was 3.5, he all of a sudden stopped being able to walk.
Oh, wow. So
He
now
went,
it's yeah, significant loss of motor function. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
there was a regression,
Mm.
motor regression,
Mhm.
which is not a sign of neurologically based muscle difference, right?
Right.
We were very lucky in that his seizures had stopped
Oh,
after the first year,
okay.
unlike many of the CRELD1 kids.
Right.
So the biggest presenting issues were still around milestones,
Mhm.
neurological things, and the muscular issues. So he stopped being able to walk, and he stopped being able to really play even for more than 15 minutes before resting.
Wow.
And no one really could help us.
Mhm.
No one knew what was wrong, but
Mhm.
now they started to say, well, we think this might be more of what we call a true muscular issue, or mitochondrial.
Mm.
So then that started a whole nother set of things. I
Now you're
ended
down
up,
the mitochondrial path. right?
I found
Yeah.
that path.
Yeah.
And I ended up sending myself to, just you as a parent, you figure out the organizations that know about these things.
And then you start researching them and calling them and yeah. Yep.
So I went to a mitochondrial conference
Huh.
in California, and that's where I met a man by the name of Dr. Sinedo, who's out of Seattle. He's a mitochondrial expert. And he listened to Ray's story and said, I think there's a mitochondrial component here. I'd like to see him.
Wow.
Again, insurance would not cover it. Again, we went private pay.
You're bringing him from Oregon down to Seattle. Yep. Yeah.
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 And then through him, he said, I think there's something to discover here. But even with mitochondrial disorders, very little is known, right?
Sure. Sure.
So insurance would not pay.
Hmm.
We didn't really go down that route. There was a muscle biopsy done. It did not indicate anything
Anything. Yeah.
really. And then eventually through Dr. Sinedo, I think, or maybe it was through a parent, I found out about the National Institute of Health and that there was a researcher there named Dr. Karsten Vonneman
Okay.
who was running a diagnostic study to find the causes of childhood neuromuscular disease that had not been discovered yet.
Hmm.
And it was really the only way that we were going to get whole exome testing.
Right. Right.
So I
Was
applied.
through like a big NIH study where your insurance
Exactly.
company wouldn't have to be part of it. Yeah. Yeah.
Now all these kids are getting the diagnostic. They get whole exome testing. It's $500. Everybody gets it. We couldn't get it.
Yeah.
And so we went into the study at the NIH to get the testing.
Mm.
And we went there and they tested him for, they did the whole exome testing. They tested him for many things over the next 5 years and found nothing.
Wow.
And
So you're
eventually,
10 years into this now, Dana.
so this was about 5 years in.
Okay. Okay.
The place where I'm taking you
I
now.
was compounding the 5 plus the 5, but okay. But you're 5 years into this.
So at the point
Yeah.
that we're at now in the story, we're about 5 years in.
Gotcha.
And as most parents, I'm just kind of dealing with what can I do for my son,
Right.
given the symptoms, right?
Right. You're just managing symptoms at this point. Yeah.
Managing symptoms, managing services, doing the physical therapy and the occupational therapy and all the things they tell you to do, and trying to figure this out. And
Mhm.
thankfully, that regression that he went into only lasted 3 months.
Really? Huh.
Yeah, it was temporary. He had 3 seizures at the end. He had some neurological tics. And right when we thought we were perhaps losing him,
Mm.
he went back to baseline.
Wow.
And then we didn't see any differences for a long time. We didn't get to the NIH until he was 5 and
Okay.
start the process.
Okay.
And then after a number of years, they basically said to us, what we'd like to do, we think that he has some form of myopathy
Mhm.
because the muscle ultrasounds that they did showed myopathic muscle fibers.
Hmm.
And that brings up an interesting thing around diagnosis, which is that there's no place, I think, other than the NIH that I'm aware of that even has a muscle ultrasound machine.
Wow.
Or that has someone who know. I've been told some other places may have it, but they don't have someone who knows how to read it.
Right.
So, for instance, with my son, they knew that his muscular issues were partly myopathic
Mhm.
and partly neurological, not just because of his clinical symptoms, but because of diagnostic testing.
Mhm.
So, the implication here is that there are kids out there they might think they have unspecified congenital myopathy. That's a big, unknown
Sounds like a big
category
umbrella term. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Without knowing anything about it, that sounds like an umbrella term to me.
Yeah, they're told that. And they'll never really know for sure because they never had the testing. Or many of the kids with CRELD1,
Right.
they probably have myopathic muscle fibers. They're so focused on the seizures that they have that they don't know some aspect of their own condition.
Mm.
So we get different kinds of information based on the resources that we're able to access in the rare disease world.
Mm.
And if you have a multisystemic condition that you're working with, you may or may not know all the parts and pieces. Because Ray actually has presented over the years more with muscular kinds of issues than
Right.
then the epileptic issues that
The
are front and
seizure,
center
yeah,
for these
yeah,
other kids, you
right.
focus on different things.
Mm,
And if a lot of, if these newly diagnosed, newly discovered diseases are not
disease,
really out
right,
in the public, the way you find your way to a diagnosis for a family like ours is through other parents.
right.
It's generally through other parents and through the groups that you find yourself
The
in.
community that you build, yeah,
Yeah, that's
yeah,
really how. And as you know from talking to Adam, he pretty much diagnosed his own child through
right,
getting information from another parent.
right, right,
And so many of these, particularly, um, genetic differences that have a mitochondrial or myopathic component, um, they they're unknown.
mm,
This is a new field of science.
mm,
So a lot of times when we're talking about something being rare, it's maybe rare because it's only newly been discovered,
right,
and you can't know the prevalence if you don't have testing.
mhm,
And you can't have testing until you've done a whole bunch of research, and
mhm,
then until you've had a paper published.
right,
So they were able to identify that what Ray had was due to mutations on the CRELD1 gene through working with our tissue samples and doing some testing in the lab at the National Institute of Health with mice. And they recognized that there was another study going on at Yale, that had kids that had a profile with similar things. They
mhm,
looked a little different. Most of them had intractable seizures, and Ray did not.
oh god,
But the testing that the research institutions have access to databases
sure,
of testing that the general public
general
would
public does
not,
not, yeah,
or hospitals, the local hospitals don't.
right,
And they recognized, in this consortium, that there was a connection between symptoms and this gene.
mm,
And through recognizing that, they then began to work with Yale to get more information, but they were able to isolate the gene.
mhm,
And then they were able to do some further research. There's all kinds of protocols to do it. So, from the time that they actually knew that this was the particular difference that was responsible for Ray's condition, to the time that you could find out from genome testing that your kid had it, was over 5 years.
unbelievable, unbelievable,
So
yeah,
here we are, and so kids are not getting diagnosed who have this condition.
right,
So we only know if a condition is rare or ultra rare if we know its prevalence in the population.
right. How else can you
And
categorize it? For sure, yeah,
yeah, and if you
yep.
don't have access to diagnostics, then you don't know. So, that's kind of what I'm saying when this I don't believe this is an ultra rare condition.
Right,
It is an ultra rare condition in that there's only maybe 2 dozen people now known that have it,
right,
but it's only been able to be picked up on a test and attributed to this gene for a year.
right,
And so Adam has shared that he gets 2 to 3 inquiries per month on the website from
sure,
families that are now finding out they're diagnosed. So we've tripled the number of known people with CRELD1,
you're really unlocking it, yeah,
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 in the
mhm,
past year.
mhm,
And I think Adam said, and I'll say, we're aware that our own children probably will not benefit
yeah,
from
yeah,
what is learned about this, but we can at least be a part of
mhm,
the process that allows other families
the benefit, yeah,
to benefit from it.
right,
Yeah. And, if you consider with CRELD, it is multisystemic, it affects the immune system.
mhm,
Uh, um, it affects all these areas. You have myopathies and mitochondrial issues and autoimmune diseases. They're proliferating like
right,
crazy in
right,
our. And so I wouldn't be surprised if 20 years from now, it might not even might not even be a rare disease. Who
sure,
knows?
sure, yeah, just more of a much more, I don't wanna use the word mainstream, Dana, but I think you understand where I'm going, like, something that
Yeah.
is akin to some more of chronic diseases that we're much
Yeah.
more
I
aware
mean,
of,
even
yeah,
if you look at the neurodevelopmental condition of autism,
right,
just in the past 20 years,
20
it's gone
years,
from,
sure,
the prevalence, it's threefold, you know,
mhm,
And we could argue about whether that's just about diagnostics or whether that's about what's contributing to neurodevelopmental and
Sure.
autoimmune diseases,
Sure. Yeah.
Um,
I think
so
the most important thing though here, right? If and please correct me if you disagree, but there's so all of these proven connections, as you mentioned, myopathy, potential links to mitochondrial dysfunction. You just mentioned autism. It's all about broadening that scope, right, of
yeah,
genetic testing and advocating for more research because gosh, you've just seen even in your own son's case these proven connections, right, Dana?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And what happens is that as we have oxidative stress related to things in our environment, whether it's
Mhm.
our food or our air or the plastics that we're taking in, that there are things within our bodies that are beginning to change our genome.
Right.
And then as we have that happen to us, and then we have children, and those children,
Yep.
have children or what have you, that we start to see changes that are either epigenetic or they're due to, just genomic instability. COVID, or
Sure.
in my case, I had long term Lyme disease. What
Mhm.
are all these things that are becoming more prevalent that are
Right.
actually changing our genes
Mm.
and changing the way that we experience health, really?
Yeah, it's a core change, and gosh, what you mentioned about plastic consumption and our environmental and impact changes, they're so complex, right? And we're gonna see those continue to evolve.
Yeah. And I think for me, you asked me what is it that kind of gets me gets me here, right? What
Yes.
what gets me interested? Having been a parent who for 10 years was searching and was navigating the
Right.
issues within the healthcare system and within, discovering all of these things. My hope is that other families can learn from
Mhm.
what many of us have been through,
Sure.
because the only thing that got me through it was the other parents on similar but different journeys that kind of walked alongside me,
I was
and
gonna
also
say
some
that
wonderful.
helped you. Yeah. Yeah, and that to me is the most and I've talked to a few moms and dads now, and I always really, um stand in awe, right, Dana, of what you folks are doing in terms of you have your hands full just with just with what has been given to you. Yet you, to your point, want others to benefit from your experience. You want others to be able to, move forward based upon the dead ends that you came up across, and like you said, the strength and the community that brings you, hope when you're kind of searching for hope. To me, that's the most amazing part about what you and other folks do is you could just sort of like stay in your little world and worry about your lane and that's it. And I don't think anybody would judge you for that. But you don't, right? You say, look, there's similar conditions impacting families. They're looking for a diagnosis and you're so critically committed to changing this.
Yeah, and I think, it's personal,
Right.
right? I
Yeah.
mean, so when it's personal, and I'm paying it forward because,
Right.
as I said, I learned from other parents. Doctors are very well meaning, but at
Sure.
the end of the day, you're only one part of their lives, but as a
Right.
parent, you're all consumed,
Hmm.
with
With your
this. And
kids. Yeah.
so
Yeah.
you do learn more.
Yeah.
Parents know more actually about these rare conditions than doctors do. And oftentimes we're teaching the doctors.
Mm.
Even my son, 2 years ago, uh, well, I should tell you, he did have another regression after
Oh,
that regression when he was younger. He had a 2-year regression.
wow.
And so, like, we're just learning about this presentation of the disease from Ray. There's no one else known right now who has the specific two mutations that he has.
Interesting.
And there's no one who has the presentation that he has
Mm.
exactly. And so, you know, what I can learn from other parents that does benefit him is also amazing. So there are so many differences between him and some of the other CRELD kids, but
Right.
when he ended up in the hospital with a what is normally the common cold, and he ended up intubated, and
Oh,
they
wow.
basically said, he has a 20% chance of getting off the ventilator. I was able to learn from another parent about an immunotherapy, and I combined that with what I knew about um, how IVIG helped people during
Okay. Yep.
COVID.
Yep.
And I was able to advocate with my doctor and say, I want him to have IVIG. It wasn't their idea. This is how it's been helping kids who are suffering with COVID, where there was a connection. And this is how it helped this one child in Minnesota. And I'm lucky enough to have doctors that are open-minded,
I was
and we
gonna
tried
say, yeah,
it.
that work alongside you. Yeah. Yeah.
And in 2 days he had turned around.
Wow.
And it was really because of my connection with another parent who
Mm,
has a child that presents in many ways differently, but they have the same condition.
mm,
And we were able to, advocate for needs. And I've seen that time and again in our small group of
right.
sharing information, what medications worked for your kid and which didn't. And really being able to change the clinical outcomes for our kids through this. And I'm hoping that the bigger picture issues that are affecting mitochondria and proteins in our bodies, and creating these myopathies, that by bringing light to this will bring light to some of the societal
Yeah.
issues
Right.
also that are affecting these things and that we don't like to talk about.
I do want to talk about those for a minute because one of the areas that I was most interested and impressed in, Dana, when you and I spoke previously, was you have this focus on the broader societal and sort of systemic issues in rare disease or newly discovered disease, which is another term I really like that you use. We talked about the role that families and patient communities should play in how research is shaped, how publications are released, sort of that broader conversation, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, you were very outspoken and and feedback that you would give in on a certain publication. There's a lot of implications there, right? About what gets published, why it gets published, how it impacts families. Can you give us a little bit more of your insights there, Dana? I think they're really
Sure.
important. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, when I was talking about how things have changed in the past 20 years with
Mm,
diagnostic testing, where what's really changed is in how people get information and how information is generated, right?
sure. Yeah.
And the way that parents are able to send their doctors to a potential diagnosis and say, hey, let's look at this the way that Adam did,
Right.
is by working with information channels.
Hmm.
And, for undiscovered or newly discovered diseases or conditions, this is connected to research institutions.
Right.
And there are the publications that research institutions put out about the disease itself. And then, the big goal of a research institution is to get more money from its donors.
Right. Of
And
course.
so a lot of what's out there in the literature about conditions is really things that are put out by the communications department
Yeah.
of a
Yeah.
research institution to try
Right.
to bring in donors. So,
So it's nuanced and it's presented and the language is very deliberate,
right.
right? Yeah. Yep.
It's presented to
Yeah.
highlight their researchers,
Yep.
and in the case of our condition, it wasn't accurately presenting how
Mm,
the disease was discovered or which
sure.
organizations were involved or what it actually is, because the Yale study was focused on epilepsy, and so you didn't see the full gamut
Mhm.
of conditions that are actually connected to this particular
Right.
genetic syndrome.
Like
And so
all the
what
ones we just
happens,
talked about. Yeah.
yeah, and so
Yeah.
what happens is people discover things by Googling
Right.
or by using ChatGPT. And these processes work with what's out there.
Mm,
And we all know that data is not necessarily information.
right.
So we have this huge data pipeline, and extracting what's most meaningful, you know, um, is not an easy process.
Sure. Sure.
And
Data to information to knowledge, really. Right. Yeah.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
And my interest is in accurate and comprehensive information
Mm,
getting out there so that families can find their diagnosis. They can
right.
find their diagnosis and the communities that they need to connect to and the treatments that they need. And so when you've got kind of research and money at the core of things, it impacts how things are written,
Mhm.
and how things are written impacts how other things are written.
Right.
And so, I started to go out there and say, hey, based on the trajectory of, the politics of
Mhm.
money and research institutions, and then just who's taking the time to talk about it and who's putting content out there, it then impacts who gets to a diagnosis.
Right.
It impacts what you pay attention to about that particular
Mhm.
disorder.
Mhm.
And these are things that I care about because I
Yeah.
care about the families.
Right. Right. I've thought a lot since our conversation about, you are really advocating for systemic change, as you said, right? Whether it be socio-political, economic, getting to accurate information, not data, right?
Yeah.
To treatment, to support for these rare disease families. Um, I would love to hear sort of, you know, you've been there, done that, Dana, to your point. So some of the advice you have, I guess, for some of those newer families that might be navigating this landscape, how do they not get pulled down into that, I guess?
How do they not get pulled down into?
Into what is being told to them by
Yeah,
the larger research machine, if we want to call it that,
yeah.
you know?
The biggest thing that I share with families, whether they're newly diagnosed with CRELD or they're
Mhm.
dealing with these issues, is to recognize kind of what I had to learn the hard way,
Yeah.
which is that you cannot put your faith in a doctor figuring out what your child has or telling
Mhm.
you what your child needs.
Mhm.
Even very well meaning doctors, like we defer to these systems and to these people and just kind of give up really responsibility for finding out what our children have and what they need. And just
Mm.
that if you are a parent of a child who has a rare disease or a not so rare disease but that needs medical attention, you really have to be the advocate
Yeah.
and you have to take that role on.
Mm.
And if it means that, I recently was sort of mentoring someone whose child lost their health care because of an administrative thing.
Ugh.
And I said, and you can't get into the doctors didn't tell me or the system didn't work. And he ended up going, driving hours away and sitting in the offices of the healthcare administration and making it happen.
Wow.
And that's what it takes.
Right.
That's really what it takes,
Mhm.
unfortunately. The good news is that when you really understand that's your role, you start to see that things change and that you can make a difference.
Mm.
And
Mm.
so I would say the biggest thing, and it's not, the fact that we don't get what we need is a multi we were talking about a multi-system disease. We have a very complex set of systems and things that get in the way of our kids getting what they need. And it's not
Right.
about blame. It's really just about going out there and figuring out what you can do
Mhm.
and who you can talk to.
Mhm.
And so I think the biggest thing that allows you to stay resilient is to find your people.
Yeah.
So get into your communities, um, and talk to other parents and get that kind of support. Don't feel alone,
Mhm.
and just understand the bigger picture that keeps our kids and us from getting what we need, and just recognize that we have to always be looking for what's the avenue that can give us more access to data so that we can discern what is the right information.
Mhm. Mhm.
I wish there was sort of an entity who cared about presenting information in a way that was accurate. But
Yeah.
like I was thinking about it, the study that we were involved in, their focus in this study was diagnosis.
Right.
Once they understood the diagnosis, the NIH is on to the next thing.
Right.
So there's no one holding the bag for the clinical piece, right? There's no one there's no entity out there that we have, the rare disease NORD. We have some places,
Correct.
but there's no one who sort of takes it on as let's make sure that accurate information is out there. So I think we all have a responsibility,
Sure.
you and myself and Adam and all the parents. And I'm constantly saying, let's really think about how we're talking about this from the standpoint of how does the way that we operate within the medical community,
Yep.
within the parent community,
Right.
within the media further the real um, information and not just the data. And
Mhm.
for the sake of what? For the sake of health, for the sake of prevention, for the sake of treatment, for the sake of family support.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Dana, this has been a very enlightening conversation. And thank you for, again, for being such an outspoken advocate and a community leader and engager as it pertains to not just CRELD1 families, but the work you're doing again in this landscape of families navigating rare diseases, newly discovered diseases, underreported diseases. It has been a pleasure to speak with you, Dana. Once again, this is Dana Brenner that joined us today, her son Ray. And how is Ray doing now?
He's doing very well.
Awesome.
He's a chess champion.
Oh, wow. That's very exciting. Wow.
He's, it will be a lifelong kind of management,
Right.
but he's
That,
doing very well.
but he likes what is it about chess that he's so enamored with?
I don't know.
You don't know? Yeah.
He's got a different brain than me, but it's it's the one thing that he's discovered that he loves.
I
Yeah.
love that. That's amazing. And to your point, that's such a lifelong thing, right? That you can do forever. So God love him for that. That's amazing. Dana, once again, thank you for your time. Thank you for sharing your story, most importantly. And again, thank you for the work that you're doing for our community.
And thank you for what you're doing as well.
Oh, you're welcome. We'll speak to you again soon.